In the spring of 2023, maritime historian Dr. Amelia Washington made a discovery that would forever change our understanding of the Atlantic slave trade and expose one of humanity's darkest chapters in unprecedented detail. While cataloging recently acquired materials at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, she encountered a daguerreotype that had been donated by the estate of a deceased Boston shipping family. The photograph, dated August 1855, showed what appeared to be the merchant vessel Esperanza, anchored in Charleston Harbor, its weathered deck empty beneath torn sails that hung like shrouds in the humid southern air. What should have been a routine addition to the museum's collection of maritime documentation became something far more profound when Dr. Washington applied modern digital enhancement techniques to the century-and-a-half-old image. There, invisible to 19th century eyes but revealed through contemporary forensic analysis, were the spectral impressions of human figures, dozens of chained souls whose agony had somehow been captured and preserved in the very chemistry of the photographic plate, creating a haunting testament to suffering that transcended the boundaries of time itself. The discovery would lead to the identification of the Esperanza as one of the last illegal slave ships to operate in American waters, a vessel that had continued the brutal human trafficking trade nearly 2 decades after it had been officially abolished by the British and American governments. Dr. Marcus Chen, a specialist in forensic historical analysis at Yale University, was contacted when preliminary research revealed that the ghostly figures in the enhanced photograph might represent evidence of atrocities that had been systematically covered up by shipping companies, government officials, and even abolitionists who had feared that public knowledge of continued slave trading would undermine their political efforts to end slavery through legal means. The Esperanza had been registered as a legitimate merchant vessel operating between Charleston, Havana, and various West African ports, carrying what shipping manifests described as general cargo and colonial goods. The ship had been owned by Blackwood Maritime Enterprises, a Boston-based company with extensive connections to both legitimate commerce and the shadowy network of merchants who had continued to profit from human trafficking despite increasing legal restrictions and international pressure to end the slave trade. Captain Isaiah Blackwood, who had commanded the Esperanza during her final voyages, had been a respected figure in Boston maritime circles, known for his business acumen and his apparent support for abolitionist causes. His public persona as a reformer had provided perfect cover for his secret involvement in illegal slave trading, enabling him to maintain relationships with both anti-slavery activists and the network of merchants, financiers, and government officials who had continued to profit from human bondage despite its official prohibition. The photograph had been taken by William Morrison, a Charleston-based photographer who had specialized in documenting maritime commerce for shipping companies and insurance firms. Morrison's assignment had been to create images that could be used for commercial purposes, documenting the condition of vessels and their cargoes for business records and legal proceedings. His reputation for technical precision and discretion had made him valuable to merchants who needed reliable documentation but preferred to avoid public scrutiny of their business activities. Dr. Washington's analysis of the mysterious photograph using advanced digital forensic technology revealed details that challenged fundamental assumptions about what photographic emulsions could capture and preserve. The enhanced image showed not only the ghostly figures of enslaved people, but also the physical evidence of their bondage: chain marks worn into the ship's deck, stains that suggested prolonged human suffering, and structural modifications to the vessel that had been designed specifically to accommodate human cargo in conditions of unimaginable cruelty. The digital enhancement process had employed multispectral imaging technology that could reveal information embedded in different wavelengths of light that had been captured by the original photographic emulsion. The technique had been developed for analyzing historical documents and artwork, but its application to the Esperanza photograph had produced results that exceeded anything previously documented in forensic photography. The spectral figures appeared to represent actual impressions left by human bodies and souls in distress, as if extreme suffering had created electromagnetic signatures that could be detected by sufficiently sensitive analytical methods. Advanced photographic analysis confirmed that the image had not been manipulated using any technique available in 1855, ruling out the possibility of deliberate falsification or artistic enhancement. Chemical analysis of the original daguerreotype plate revealed that the spectral impressions were present in the silver halide emulsion itself, created through photochemical processes that had occurred at the time of the original exposure. The authenticity of the phenomena suggested that the photographic process had somehow captured and preserved evidence of human suffering in ways that transcended conventional understanding of how images were created and recorded. The investigation revealed that Morrison had been aware that something unusual had been captured in his photograph, though his understanding of the phenomena had been limited by 19th-century scientific knowledge. His personal journal, discovered in the Charleston Historical Society archives, contained references to disturbances in the photographic emulsion and anomalous impressions that had appeared in images taken aboard certain vessels, particularly those involved in what he discreetly termed the irregular trade. The photographic plates taken aboard the Esperanza have revealed impressions that cannot be explained by normal exposure to light and shadow, Morrison wrote in his journal entry, dated August 15, 1855. The images show figures and markings that were not visible during the photography session, yet appear with such clarity and detail that they cannot be dismissed as defects in the emulsion. Most disturbing is the consistency of these impressions across multiple photographic sessions, suggesting that they represent some form of permanent alteration to the vessel itself. If you're as intrigued as we are by these secrets of the past, consider subscribing to not miss any of our future investigations. Morrison's technical notes revealed that he had experimented with different photographic techniques and chemicals in an attempt to understand why certain vessels produced anomalous images, while others did not. His research had led him to conclude that ships involved in the slave trade possessed what he termed residual impressions that could be detected by photographic emulsions under specific conditions, though he had been unable to explain the scientific mechanisms responsible for these phenomena. Dr. Chen's research into the historical context surrounding the photograph revealed that the summer of 1855 had been a period of intense activity for illegal slave traders who were rushing to complete as many voyages as possible before anticipated changes in federal enforcement policies made their operations too dangerous to continue. The Esperanza had been one of dozens of vessels operating in this shadow economy, carrying human cargo between West Africa, the Caribbean, and the American South, in violation of laws that had been passed decades earlier, but remained poorly enforced due to political resistance and commercial interests. The illegal slave trade of the 1850s had been characterized by conditions that were even more brutal than those of the legal trade that had preceded it. Ships had been forced to operate in secrecy, using modified designs and sailing routes that prioritized concealment over the minimal comfort and safety considerations that had characterized earlier slave vessels. The Esperanza had been specifically modified for this trade, with hidden compartments, false bulkheads, and ventilation systems that had been designed to maximize the number of people who could be transported while minimizing the evidence of their presence if the ship were boarded by authorities. The investigation expanded to include research into the broader network of merchants, financiers, and government officials who had enabled the continuation of illegal slave trading despite federal prohibitions and increasing international pressure. Dr. Washington discovered that the Blackwood Maritime Enterprises had been part of a sophisticated criminal organization that had included prominent businessmen, politicians, and even some individuals who had publicly supported abolitionist causes while secretly profiting from human trafficking. The criminal network had been protected by a combination of political corruption, economic influence, and social connections that had made investigation and prosecution extremely difficult for the limited number of federal officials who had been genuinely committed to enforcing anti-slavery laws. Many government officials had been either directly involved in the illegal trade or had received financial benefits that made them reluctant to pursue aggressive enforcement actions against slave traders. Captain Isaiah Blackwood's background revealed the complex social and economic factors that had enabled educated and apparently respectable individuals to participate in systematic human rights violations while maintaining their standing in civilized society. Born to a prominent Boston family with extensive maritime and commercial connections, Blackwood had been educated at Harvard College and had initially pursued a career in legitimate shipping before being drawn into the more lucrative but morally reprehensible business of human trafficking. Blackwood's transformation from legitimate merchant to slave trader had been gradual, beginning with his involvement in shipping ventures that had operated in legal gray areas before progressing to direct participation in illegal human trafficking. His education and social connections had enabled him to develop the sophisticated cover operations and political protection that had been necessary for successful slave trading during the 1850s, when federal enforcement efforts had made such activities increasingly dangerous for less well-connected operators. The investigation revealed that the Esperanza had made at least 12 illegal slave trading voyages between 1853 and 1855, transporting an estimated 3,200 enslaved Africans to markets in Cuba, Brazil, and the American South. The vessel's modified design had enabled it to carry far more human cargo than its official tonnage would have suggested, cramming people into spaces that had been barely adequate for animal transport, let alone human beings who required food, water, fresh air, and basic sanitation to survive the weeks-long Atlantic crossings. The conditions aboard illegal slave ships like the Esperanza had been documented by the few government officials and naval officers who had successfully intercepted such vessels during the 1850s. Their reports had described scenes of unimaginable horror, hundreds of people chained together in spaces so small that they could not sit upright, surrounded by human waste, disease, and the bodies of those who had died during the voyage. The mortality rates on these illegal ships had often exceeded 50%, making the trade profitable despite the enormous loss of human life that had characterized every voyage. Dr. Washington's analysis of the enhanced photograph revealed evidence of these horrific conditions preserved in the photographic record. The spectral impressions showed the outlines of human bodies packed tightly together, chain marks that indicated how people had been restrained during the voyage, and stains on the deck and bulkheads that suggested the presence of blood, vomit, and other evidence of extreme human suffering. Most disturbing were the facial expressions visible in the ghostly figures, which showed levels of agony and despair that seemed to transcend the normal range of human emotion. The enhanced images had been subjected to detailed analysis by experts in forensic psychology and trauma research, who had confirmed that the expressions captured in the spectral impressions were consistent with extreme psychological and physical distress. The consistency and detail of these expressions across different figures in the photograph suggested that they represented genuine documentation of human suffering rather than photographic artifacts or observer imagination. Modern scientific analysis of the phenomena captured in the Esperanza photograph had involved consultation with physicists, chemists, and other specialists who had attempted to understand how human suffering could create permanent impressions that were detectable by photographic technology. The leading theory suggested that extreme emotional and physical distress could create electromagnetic fields or chemical changes that were capable of altering photographic emulsions in ways that preserved evidence of traumatic events. The scientific research had revealed that human emotional states could indeed produce measurable electromagnetic effects, and that extreme trauma could create chemical changes in the human body that might be detectable by sensitive analytical methods. While the precise mechanisms responsible for the spectral impressions remained unclear, the evidence suggested that the combination of extreme suffering and the chemical properties of 19th-century photographic emulsions had created conditions that enabled the preservation of trauma in permanent visual form. As we delve deeper into these mysteries, we invite you to join our community of explorers of the inexplicable. Subscribe and become part of the search for truth. The investigation revealed that Morrison had attempted to document these phenomena by taking additional photographs aboard other vessels involved in the slave trade, creating what amounted to an accidental archive of evidence documenting the continuation of illegal human trafficking during the 1850s. His photographs had captured similar spectral impressions aboard at least 6 other vessels, providing corroborating evidence that the phenomena were associated specifically with ships that had been used to transport enslaved people under conditions of extreme cruelty. Morrison's photographic archive had been dispersed after his death in 1857, with individual images being sold to collectors or donated to historical societies without any understanding of their significance as documentation of illegal slave trading. The rediscovery and analysis of these images had provided historians with unprecedented visual evidence of the scope and brutality of the illegal slave trade that had continued decades after its official prohibition. Dr. Chen's research into federal enforcement records revealed that government officials had been aware of the continued illegal slave trading, but had been largely unable or unwilling to take effective action against the well-connected merchants and politicians who had profited from human trafficking. The few successful prosecutions had typically involved small-scale operators who had lacked the political protection and financial resources necessary to avoid conviction, while major slave traders like Captain Blackwood had continued their operations with relative impunity. The political protection enjoyed by major slave traders had been based on a combination of direct corruption, economic influence, and ideological support from politicians and business leaders who had viewed the continuation of slavery as essential for maintaining Southern economic prosperity and social stability. Even many Northern politicians who had publicly opposed slavery had been reluctant to pursue aggressive enforcement actions that might have disrupted profitable business relationships or created political complications with Southern allies. The investigation revealed that the Esperanza had been captured by federal authorities in September 1855, just weeks after Morrison's photographs had been taken, but that Captain Blackwood had avoided prosecution through a combination of political influence and legal maneuvering that had been typical of how major slave traders had escaped justice during this period. The ship had been sold at auction and had eventually been converted to legitimate merchant service, while Blackwood had retired from active slave trading with a substantial fortune that had enabled him to become a respected philanthropist and supporter of various social causes. Blackwood's post-slave trading career had included substantial donations to abolitionist organizations and educational institutions, creating a public image as a reformed merchant who had seen the error of his ways and had dedicated his later life to promoting human rights and social justice. This transformation had been typical of how many slave traders had sought to rehabilitate their reputations after retiring from human trafficking, using their ill-gotten wealth to purchase social respectability and historical amnesia about their crimes against humanity. The investigation expanded to include research into the fate of the people who had been transported aboard the Esperanza during its illegal slave trading operations. While individual records had been largely destroyed or never created, demographic and genealogical research had enabled Dr. Washington to identify descendants of some of the enslaved people who had survived transportation aboard the vessel. These descendants had provided oral histories and family traditions that had corroborated the evidence of extreme brutality documented in Morrison's photographs. The oral histories had included accounts of ancestors who had survived the Middle Passage aboard ships that matched the description of the Esperanza, describing conditions of unimaginable cruelty and suffering that had been consistent with the evidence preserved in the enhanced photographic images. Many families had maintained traditions about ancestors who had died during the Atlantic crossing or shortly after arrival in the Americas, victims of the disease, malnutrition, and trauma that had characterized illegal slave trading during the 1850s. The investigation revealed that the spectral impressions visible in the enhanced photograph represented not just anonymous victims, but specific individuals whose lives and deaths could be partially reconstructed through careful historical research. Dr. Washington had worked with genealogical experts and community historians to identify at least 17 people whose stories could be connected to the Esperanza, creating individual narratives that had personalized the abstract horror of the slave trade and had provided names and histories for some of those whose suffering had been preserved in the photographic record. Among the identified individuals was Kwame Asante, a young man from present-day Ghana who had been captured during a village raid and had survived the voyage aboard the Esperanza, only to die of disease within weeks of arriving in Charleston. His story had been preserved through oral traditions maintained by his descendants who had emigrated to Boston during the Great Migration and had maintained family memories about their ancestors' experiences during the Middle Passage. Another identified individual was Amara Diallo, a woman from present-day Senegal who had been pregnant when she was captured and had given birth aboard the Esperanza, under conditions so terrible that the infant had died within days. Amara had survived to be sold in Charleston, but had died shortly afterward from complications related to the trauma and malnutrition she had experienced during the Atlantic crossing. Her story had been preserved through the testimony of other enslaved people who had known her and had passed down her story through several generations. The personal stories reconstructed through this research had provided individual faces and names for the anonymous suffering documented in the enhanced photograph, transforming abstract historical horror into specific human tragedies that could be understood and remembered as the experiences of real people rather than statistical abstractions. The personalization had been essential for enabling contemporary audiences to comprehend the full human cost of the slave trade and to connect emotionally with historical events that might otherwise have seemed too distant and abstract to generate appropriate moral response. Modern descendants of enslaved people who had been transported aboard the Esperanza had responded to the discovery of Morrison's photographs with complex mixtures of grief, anger, and gratitude that evidence of their ancestors' suffering had finally been preserved and acknowledged. Many had expressed appreciation that the photographic documentation provided tangible proof of historical experiences that had often been minimized or denied by those who had preferred to avoid confronting the full extent of American involvement in the slave trade. The emotional impact of viewing the enhanced photographs had been profound for descendant communities, who had described feeling a direct connection to ancestors whose suffering had been literally preserved in the photographic record. Many had reported experiencing the images as a form of communication from their ancestors, a message across time that their pain had not been forgotten and that their experiences continued to matter for contemporary understanding of American history and African American identity. Dr. Washington's final analysis of the Esperanza photograph concluded that it represented unprecedented documentation of the Atlantic slave trade that challenged conventional understanding of both historical photography and the mechanisms by which traumatic experiences could be preserved and transmitted across time. The spectral impressions provided evidence that extreme human suffering could create permanent traces that were detectable by sensitive analytical methods, suggesting that historical trauma might leave physical signatures that could be recovered and interpreted by future generations. The investigation revealed that the illegal slave trade of the 1850s had been characterized by levels of brutality that had exceeded even the horrific conditions of the legal slave trade that had preceded it, as merchants had been forced to operate in secrecy and had prioritized concealment and profit over any minimal concern for human welfare. The Esperanza and similar vessels had been floating prisons where thousands of people had experienced unimaginable suffering while being transported to lives of bondage in the Americas. The research had broader implications for understanding how historical trauma could be documented and preserved for future study, suggesting that conventional historical sources might be supplemented by scientific analysis of physical objects and locations that had been associated with traumatic events. The forensic analysis of the Esperanza photograph had demonstrated that modern technology could reveal evidence of historical suffering that had been invisible to contemporary observers, providing new methods for documenting and understanding human rights violations. The discovery had also provided important lessons about how individuals and institutions could maintain facades of respectability while participating in systematic human rights violations, demonstrating the ways that social privilege and economic influence could enable people to escape accountability for crimes against humanity. Captain Blackwood's ability to transition from slave trader to philanthropist had illustrated how wealth accumulated through human trafficking could be used to purchase social legitimacy and historical amnesia. Contemporary scholars of slavery and human trafficking who had been consulted during the investigation acknowledged that the methods demonstrated in the Esperanza case could potentially be applied to other historical sites and artifacts that had been associated with systematic human rights violations. The forensic techniques used to reveal the spectral impressions might provide new tools for documenting historical trauma and for recovering evidence of experiences that had been deliberately concealed or forgotten. The investigation had revealed the continuing relevance of historical slave trading for understanding contemporary human trafficking, showing how many of the same economic incentives, political protection mechanisms, and social attitudes that had enabled 19th century slave traders continued to facilitate modern forms of human bondage. The techniques used by Captain Blackwood and his associates to avoid accountability for their crimes had remained remarkably consistent across different historical periods and geographical locations. Human rights organizations consulted during the investigation had noted that the documentation provided by the Esperanza photographs could serve as powerful educational tools for raising awareness about both historical and contemporary human trafficking, providing vivid evidence of the human cost of treating people as commodities to be bought and sold for profit. The images had been incorporated into educational programs designed to promote understanding of the historical roots of contemporary human rights violations. In her concluding report, Dr. Washington reflected on the profound implications of the Esperanza discovery for understanding both the historical reality of the Atlantic slave trade and the ways that extreme human suffering could transcend normal boundaries of time and space to communicate with future generations. The photograph that captured the spectral impressions of enslaved people served as a reminder that the victims of historical human rights violations continued to have voices that could be heard by those who possessed the technology and moral commitment necessary to listen to their testimony. The story of the invisible chains reminds us that the true extent of historical human rights violations may be far greater than conventional historical records suggest, and that modern technology may provide tools for recovering evidence of suffering that has been deliberately concealed or forgotten by those who profited from human tragedy. The spectral impressions preserved in Morrison's photograph demonstrated that the victims of the Atlantic slave trade had left traces of their experiences that could still be detected and interpreted more than a century and a half after their deaths. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation revealed that the suffering of enslaved people had not been anonymous or abstract, but had involved specific individuals whose names, stories, and experiences could be recovered through careful historical research and community engagement. The personalization of historical trauma through genealogical research and oral history collection had transformed statistical abstractions into human stories that could generate appropriate emotional and moral responses from contemporary audiences. The photographic evidence of spectral impressions aboard the Esperanza suggested that extreme human suffering could create permanent traces that transcended normal understanding of how traumatic experiences were recorded and transmitted. The scientific analysis of these phenomena had opened new possibilities for understanding the relationship between trauma and memory, suggesting that historical violence might leave physical signatures that could be detected and interpreted by future generations who possessed sufficiently sensitive analytical tools. The past guards secrets that challenge comprehension, and what we've uncovered in the shadows of that slave ship reveals that some forms of human suffering are so profound that they transcend the normal boundaries of time and space, creating permanent testimonies to cruelty that can be recovered and interpreted by those who have the courage to confront the full extent of historical human rights violations. Perhaps the real question isn't whether the spectral impressions represent genuine documentation of slave trade atrocities, but whether we have the moral commitment necessary to honor the testimony of those whose suffering has been preserved in the very fabric of historical artifacts. The true nature of this tragedy remains in the shadows, but we want to know your opinion. Use the comment section below and tell us what you believe. If you are fascinated by unraveling the secrets behind our darkest histories, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, for there is much more to be unmasked.